Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a pretty heavy but absolutely crucial topic: how some truly horrific historical tragedies basically forced the global medical community to write the fundamental rules that protect every single one of us today. We're looking at the genesis of bioethics, a subject that sits right at the intersection of human ambition, moral philosophy, and literal life-or-death consequences. Let's just confront a dark reality right off the bat. The noble pursuit of scientific knowledge, that drive to cure disease and understand the human body, has, at times, come at a completely devastating human cost. When you look at the documents we're analyzing today, it's clear that without a firmly established moral framework, the pure, unadulterated drive for data can actually blind researchers to the humanity of their own subjects.
Now, for literally millennia, Western medicine relied on what was essentially an honor system. It was all anchored by the Hippocratic Oath, drafted way back in 500 BCE, and its core principle, primum non nocere, or first do no harm. And for the longest time, that was considered the absolute gold standard. But as we're going to see, modern science, with all its rapid advancements and super complex interventions, would very quickly prove this ancient honor system to be wildly insufficient.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start out with science unchecked, move into the tragedies that demanded change, cover the birth of bioethics, look at formalizing the rules, and finally wrap up with the Belmont report. Let's dive in. Kicking things off with Section 1, Science Unchecked, and that relentless drive for data. So, as the 20th century really started accelerating, it brought with it these massive, game-changing breakthroughs in biotechnology and the life sciences. We're talking intensive care units, organ transplants, advanced vaccines, the whole shebang. But suddenly, researchers found themselves in totally uncharted territory. Traditional ethical theories, they simply couldn't answer these novel moral questions. There were huge glaring gaps, or lacunas, in the legal and ethical systems. The old top-down approach of just applying basic philosophy didn't work anymore for things like, say, deciding who gets scarce medical resources or how to test highly experimental serums. Moving to Section 2, Tragedies Demand Change. Because bioethics definitely did not emerge in a peaceful vacuum. Just take a look at the striking, decades-long gap plotted out here. You've got 1932, the start of the Tuskegee Study, and then scan all the way over to 1979, when the Belmont report is finally published. That is a nearly 50-year gap. 50 years, where vulnerable people were exposed to systemic harm while the academic and regulatory frameworks were just slowly, painstakingly playing catch-up. And the source material makes this incredibly clear. The formal rules of bioethics were basically reactionary. They were desperate, firefighting responses to flagrant injustices. You have the horrific exploitation of unwilling prisoners in Nazi concentration camp experiments during the Second World War. And over in the US, you had the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, which deliberately exploited disadvantaged rural Black men just to study the untreated course of the disease. Incredibly, they were actually deprived of demonstrably effective treatments, like penicillin once it was widely available, just so researchers wouldn't interrupt their data collection. This cruel injustice of deliberately withholding a known cure, that hit the nail on the head for exactly why these rules became so desperately needed. That brings us to Section 3, the conceptual birth of bioethics, where the medical community realizes they need a whole new philosophy. Now, a lot of people think bioethics is a product of the 1970s, but it actually traces back way further. German theologian Fritz Jahr coined the term bioethic back in 1927. That is well before those massive global crises of the mid-century. He was forcefully arguing for a new academic discipline, really pleading for a much more civilized, ethical approach to how we treat human beings, animals, and even the environment. Fast forward a few decades, and researchers really took that foundational concept and ran with it. In 1970, Van Rensselaer Potter published a super influential article, Bioethics, the Science of Survival, where he suggested that bioethics needs to be a global movement. Scientists were finally waking up to the fact that science needed a formal conscience to ensure humanity's actual survival in a rapidly advancing world. It was no longer just about having a good bedside manner. It was literally about the survival and dignity of the human species. Which leads perfectly into Section 4, Formalizing the Rules. Because writing academic papers wasn't going to be enough. Drafted directly in response to the atrocities uncovered during the war crime trials, the Nuremberg Code of 1947 established the very first prototype for medical standards in human research. Its absolute first point: the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. It laid down the law declaring that no human being could ever be experimented on without their clear, uncoerced, and legally capable consent. Period. It also demanded that experiments actually yield fruitful results for society, avoid unnecessary suffering, and, crucially, give the subject the liberty to just walk away and end the experiment. This prototype was a massive game changer, eventually paving the way for the World Medical Association's Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, which expanded these international guidelines even further. So, while Nuremberg and Helsinki laid the vital international groundwork, the United States eventually formalized its own comprehensive analytical framework with the publication of the Belmont Report on April 18, 1979. Created by a national commission, this wasn't just a basic list of rules. It actually identified the fundamental ethical principles that should underlie all biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects. And that brings us to our final section, the Belmont Report and its 3 basic principles. But before they could even establish those principles, the Commission realized they had to draw a really strict boundary. They needed to define what exactly they were regulating. So a doctor providing therapy to heal you, that doctor is engaged in practice. But a scientist testing a new protocol on you to draw broad conclusions, that is research. And here's the kicker. Even if a new procedure is highly experimental, it doesn't automatically make it research unless it's formally designed to test a hypothesis and develop generalizable knowledge. It's the specific kind of research that requires rigorous oversight to protect the people involved. To actually provide that oversight, the Belmont Report established 3 basic ethical principles. And listen, these aren't just polite suggestions. They are prescriptive judgments designed to guide investigators and review boards through some incredibly complex, real-world ethical dilemmas where rules might naturally conflict. Let's break them down. First up is respect for persons. Building directly on that Nuremberg Code foundation, this principle demands that subjects must be fully informed volunteers. You absolutely have to acknowledge an individual's autonomy and their right to make choices about their own body. But it also recognizes a tough reality. Not everyone is capable of self-determination, so it mandates extensive protection for populations with diminished autonomy, like infants, the severely ill, or folks who are institutionalized, ensuring they are never, ever subtly coerced or unduly influenced into participating. The second principle is beneficence. Now, this takes that ancient Hippocratic oath and pushes it a massive step further. We're not just talking about do no harm anymore. It's a positive obligation to actively maximize potential benefits while systematically minimizing any risks of harm. The Belmont Report requires a highly rigorous, non-arbitrary array of data. Basically, a systematic assessment of the probability and magnitude of risks versus benefits before a single test subject is ever touched. Researchers can't just guess or hope for the best. They have to objectively prove the risks are justified. Finally, we have the principle of justice. This directly, forcefully answers the horrific injustices of the Tuskegee Study and the Nazi camps. Justice mandates fairness in distribution. Researchers can no longer systematically select disadvantaged classes like ward patients, racial minorities, or prisoners simply because they're easily available or maybe easier to manipulate. The burdens of research have to be shared fairly across society. And conversely, the benefits of that research cannot be restricted only to those who can afford them. So as we wrap up this explainer, it's pretty wild to see just how far we've come from an era of unchecked exploitation to a highly rigorous system of informed consent and ethical review. But we really have to look to the future. With astonishing new scientific frontiers opening up right now, like gene editing and AI, we have to ask ourselves, are the ethical frameworks born from these past tragedies actually going to be enough to guide us tomorrow? It's a massive question, one that literally keeps bioethicists awake at night, and definitely one we all need to be thinking about as we navigate the very edge of future science.